Welcome back. Earlier in the program, we talked about how the president is diverting money from the Pentagon to pay for his border wall. In this segment, we're going to get an inside look at our military and how it conducts war, and we'll do that through the eyes of a soldier. It all comes from a new book called Places and Names on War, Revolution, and Returning. I recently spoke with its author, Elliot Ackerman. Elliot, you have a unique perspective on our nation's recent military conflicts, having served in Iraq and Afghanistan and covered Syria. I'm curious, is our mission to those areas clear to the men and women who wear our uniform? Was it clear to you when you served? Is it clear to you now?
Well, I think the mission has obviously evolved in the many years that the U.S. has been at war in the Middle East. But the specifics of that mission in a strategic sense, have at times been more clear and then less clear. But I think the reason, men and women fight is the same reason it's always been. They're fighting for each other. And that is usually the most immediate concern, is keeping, your brothers and sisters safe.
Well, what drives those brothers and sisters into military service in the first place? Is it duty to country? Is it belief in the mission? Is it just a job? I'm curious what drove you to the military and what's driven many of your former colleagues into the military?
Well, I think for every person it's different, so it's very difficult to generalize. As for myself, I was somebody who wanted to serve his country. I wanted a lot of responsibility at a young age, and I had always had an interest in the military. So you combine those factors together, it led me into the Marine Corps.
You also wrote and have talked about meeting another veteran from the Iraq War, but this veteran served on the other side and was fighting for Al-Qaeda. I'm curious, why did you want to meet him, and what did you learn from that meeting?
I spent most of my 20s and some of my 30s, fighting in our wars. And for me, they were the defining experience of my life. However, at home, people who are of my generation, these wars were not generationally defining for them. However, when you've fought in a war, there's somebody on the other side. And I was interested in who that person was and whether I had defined them just as they had defined me. And so when I had the chance to sit down with someone who'd fought for Al-Qaeda in Iraq, I took the opportunity. I'm curious, was it just their adventures in the war on the opposite side, or were you curious as to what motivated them, what led them into the conflict, and that sort of thing, getting to know the person as opposed to the soldier? Well, I'd spent a lot of time, really much of my life, thinking about the many ways me and this one person, his name is Abu Hassar, and I write about him in the book, thinking of the many ways we were different. And I came to the end of my war, and I knew the ways we were different, and we were still different. But I wanted to start to try to understand some of the ways that we might be the same. And those were significant and in some ways more profound.
Do you wish you had known that about him while you were fighting against him and against Al-Qaeda, or is that something that, as a soldier, was better left until after the fighting was done, or after your fighting was done?
Well, I think when I was fighting, when I say the ways we were the same, I mean, we were two people who were of the same generation, although we grew up in different countries, and for us, the defining event of our young lives was the war. So I think intellectually and abstractly, I knew that about the people I was fighting against, that just as these were defining events for me, they would be defining events for those people. But I had never met any of them. I never sat down across a table from one and met them, and I wanted to meet them. And so having that experience, it became less an abstraction and much more tangible.
Speaking of abstraction, a lot of people tend to view wars and military conflicts in almost a feature film sort of way. High tech, lots of remote weapons, soldiers armed with the best tech and the best weaponry and defense systems. I'm curious, how does the reality compare? Is it that much different from what people expect, or is it actually sort of similar to the way it was generations ago, where you're really lined up against the enemy and taking aim?
Well, I think the thing that, whether it's Hollywood or even books, can never really capture about war, because it's not particularly interesting, is how boring war is. When you're at war, there are these long periods of boredom, and it's famously been said, punctuated by periods of terror. And that is true. So if you were to watch a 2-hour Hollywood movie and all the action that's in that movie, but expand it out over, instead of 2 hours, maybe 7 months or a year, that's sort of what going to war is like.
You said something else in an interview related to the book that caught my attention, that winning and losing wars are actually outliers, and that most wars lead essentially to quagmires. And it's pretty easy to suggest at this point, I think, that Iraq and Afghanistan are such quagmires. Does that impact how you view your service and your time in the military? If you know at the end of the day that it was all basically to keep the status quo or in furtherance of a quagmire, does that negate your service and the service of your colleagues?
I don't feel that it does, because for me, my decision to serve was a very personal one, and I look back at my service, and I think of the most significant moments as being, ones when I was in combat, and I can think of the things that people did for me and I did for other people in those moments, and I'm glad I was there. And I feel very proud of the fact that I was there. And whether or not the endeavor we were engaged in strategically, worked out, doesn't negate the things we did for one another. Now, do I wish it worked out better? Do I wish that, the Iraq War, the Afghan wars were prosecuted more capably? Of course I do. But when I look back on those wars and I see that they haven't gone as our leaders expected them to go, it doesn't make me feel as though the things we did for one another were any less valuable.
You come back home and there's a tagline almost of supporting our troops, and there's certainly plenty of support for our troops, but in a lot of ways it's become something of a bit of lip service. While people will say it, we get policy changes that, talk about veterans care or even a recent headline that we're taking money away from military construction. Do you feel like America supports its military, supports its soldiers and sailors and Marines, or that it's mostly a punchline for politicians and for people to feel better about themselves?
I think at this point, America is operating in a real space of moral hazard where we are fighting these endless wars that we don't pay taxes on and that we source through an all-volunteer military. And those wars will go on forever this way. That's what I mean by moral hazard. I think the greatest thing that we as a nation could do to support the troops per se would be to re-implement a draft. Because I think until every American has got something invested in our wars, we are living in a skewed sense of reality with how we view ourselves in the world, and it's a very dangerous position to be in.
You sound like a critic of our military conflicts right now in Afghanistan and Iraq. Would you label yourself that way?
I'm a critic of the policies. I think we should be asking ourselves some very hard questions if we're sitting here, in Afghanistan with a war that's gone on for 18 years. And, even if that war is able to come to some type of terminus soon, we should do the hard work of looking back and saying, how do we get here where we've just fought a nearly 20-year war? Maybe the way we've been fighting wars is something we should look at so that they don't just drag on and on as they've done recently.
Finally, Elliot, as a veteran, you're speaking out, you're writing your books, and you're making statements like the one you just made. And I can't help but contrast that to former Defense Secretary James Mattis, who it's pretty clear has a substantial disagreement with the president on some of his policies, but hasn't really wanted to be critical of the president. I don't want to put you in a tough spot here, but I'm curious, do you think that former military leaders should be critical of policies that they think are disagreeable, or do you think that their better service is loyalty to the president and keeping their mouth shut?
I think it's a very personal decision that each individual needs to make, particularly those who've held positions at the highest policy levels. So I'm not critical of General Mattis if he doesn't want to go on the record, against President Trump at this point. And at the same time, when there are leaders who come out and want to speak their minds, we live in a democratic republic, and they have the right to speak their minds. I don't want to sit here and say that former military leaders are obligated to speak their mind or that they have to stay silent. I think they should have the opportunity to do what they think is best.
Elliot Ackerman is a retired Marine. He is the author of Places and Names on War, Revolution, and Returning. Elliot, thank you both for your service and for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And up next, our Corridor Report, a look at some stories from across our region, including how New York Governor Andrew Cuomo wants to make major changes to the way people vote in the Empire State, at least when it comes to voting for president.